The impact upon the culture of the inhabitants of Spain, of what is now Spain, Portugal, Crete, Sicily, etc., would include the following. The Moors set up a postal system. They become the backbone of metal, wood, leather, wool, and the silk industries. They have a sewage system and latrines with hot and cold running water by the 10th century. Lighted streets. They're practicing food preservation through dehydration, preserving wheat for as long as 100 years. In fact, a man named Ibn al-Aswan, writing in the 12th century, wrote a book on how to preserve corn oil, how to preserve various fruits and vegetables through the process of dehydration. What's unique about this is that the Moors simply didn't engage in these activities without writing them down, but they were voluminous writers. They also, as we will see, set up a system of libraries and a book-selling system where these books and materials are made available not only to the population of Andalus, but the people beyond those borders. The Moors introduced new agricultural and irrigation methods which made the land vastly more productive than it had been under the Romans, and certainly under the Visigoths. They made algebra an exact science and founded plane and spherical trigonometry, which never existed among the Greeks. Pharmacology, surgery, cauterization, ophthalmic surgery, lithotrides, which is the destruction of kidney stones, and the establishing of a licensing exam for physicians were a part of Moorish society, what the Moors instituted into the region. Meanwhile, Europeans are relying on charms and amulets, visits to holy shrines. You had people going to a cathedral in Chartres in order to get well. If someone was said to be sick, they would either, generally the treatments were as follows. Either you would simply pray for the person and take them to a holy shrine, or you would leech them. You know what leeching is? You basically bleed. You cover someone in leeches and then hope that it sucks all the impurities and so forth and everything out of the person, and it did, along with life itself. The Moors also were using monkey skeletons imported from Africa when cadavers weren't available. What does that then tell us about what the Moors knew anatomically, physiologically? It tells us that the Moors were obviously aware of some sort of physiological and anatomical connection between primates and humans. Now, I'm careful on this because I will say this. The Moors didn't say that people descended from apes. I leave that to Charles Darwin, because I think there's something else, there's something quote-unquote Freudian about that. That's the whole nother topic. But the Moors simply said that there was or recognized there was an anatomical and physiological correlation between primates and humans. For that reason, if you were practicing as a surgeon, which the Moors excelled in, you could use certain sorts of primates to figure out where certain things were. And that way, when engaged in any kind of medical practices, you knew what the body structure was. As Europeans, who are also a part of the society, because now you have, again, Visigoths and Vandals, who are quote-unquote Germanic people, who are living in the area, who are taken control of, in terms of the nation itself, by the Moors. But what happens is, these people begin to recognize the impact of these Moors on developing their own civilization, and they begin to consider the Moors as almost, in many cases, supernatural or superhuman in terms of their understanding of certain science and their understanding of the natural world. As a result, they then begin to try to enter in study with the Moors. The Moors do not establish a system where they exclude anyone from the madrasas. The madrasas are the schools. Schools are open to all. They don't care if you're Muslim, Christian, or indifferent. The school's open to everyone, and as a result, the quote-unquote Spaniards, and they become Spaniards later, because obviously at this point there is no Spain, but the people who become the Spaniards end up studying Moorish philosophy, Moorish sciences, and making use of this, ultimately, for their own social and political aggrandizement later. As a result, people beyond the borders of Andalus, which is what the Moors called the Iberian Peninsula, begin to hear about what's happening in Moorish Spain. So people start to come into the area to study. You have a nun writing in a German province in Saxony about the Moorish cities as being the jewels of the world. The major cities, Cordova, Seville, Toledo, Granada, those areas become central centers for study of Moorish philosophy and science, and Europeans are flooding the borders. As long as they come in peace, as they say, there's no problem. You have in the city of Cordova, in the 10th century, 1,600 mosques, 900 public baths, 213,000 middle-class homes, 60,000 mansions, and 80,000 shops, 20,000 of which are booksellers or bookshops. This is in the 10th century. And this is going to play very prominently later when we see what happens. 20,000 bookshops. Wealthier homes had 2 floors, a library, gardens, and running water. The population, again in the 10th century, is between 500,000 to 1 million people. And that's in the city of Cordova alone. England had barely that amount in its entire borders at that time. Needless to say, England was also steeped in squalor and filth, and actually had considerable contempt for bathing. And this plays very prominently later. I don't know if you've ever seen this book, but I think, by all means, you might call this the equalizer. Because when Europeans find out about their own history, their own love affair with dirt, written by their own, and African nationals didn't write this book. Terence McLaughlin. Terence McLaughlin is an Englishman. I think he's a journalist, and he did a history of dirt. And reveals some very interesting things. Maybe I'll read a few sections just to make my point. McLaughlin is describing the monasteries, and he points out that the monasteries were considered the cleanest places initially, because the monks bathed, or I should say changed their clothes once a year. That was considered Here was found a deep pit, 18 foot 8 inches long, the walls 15 inches thick. The depth of the pit below the cloister floor was 25 feet. Filled in the pit were old gowns torn up by the monks and used as toilet paper. Evidence too that the monks suffered from digestive troubles as a result of not having bathed but once a year. There was another section that I wanted to get, and let me see if I can find it, because that's mild by comparison. Page 7. See, these are the books that I never came across in history class. Studying history, European history, and nobody talked about this. This is the beloved King James. And this is an account written by one of his contemporaries. So this is one of his English brethren. In describing him, he says, his beard was very thin, his tongue too large for his mouth, which made him drink very uncomely, as if drinking his tongue, which came out into the cup of each side of his mouth. His skin was soft as taffeta sarcenet, which felt so, because he never washed his hands, only rubbed his finger ends slightly with the wet end of a napkin. His legs are very weak, having had, as some thought, some foul play in his youth, or rather before he was born, that he was not able to stand at 7 years of age. That weakness made him ever leaning on other men's shoulders. His walk was ever circular, his fingers ever in that walk, fiddling about his codpiece. Now, that's an interesting point itself. He tells us earlier that King James would also wear his clothes until they were falling off of his body. He wore his clothes unto rags.
Which King James?
King James the First.
Okay, as long as it's not the one that had the Bible.
As long as it's not the one who wrote the Bible.
Why? He did the same thing.
Yeah, that's another lecture. We're told also that in the centers, in European centers, particularly in areas like Sicily, where there was a large Moorish presence in the 13th and 12th century, we're told that the Moors, who had reintroduced the concept of bathing to some of the Italians, but to some of the other European peoples, there was no reintroduction of bathing. There was no bathing. The Angles, the Saxons, the Picts didn't bathe. The Italians, the Romans bathed. They had bathhouses. When Rome fell, that was it. The Romans stopped bathing as well. So in the case of the Moors, they reintroduced this, but for some reason, the Anglo-Saxons and the Picts and the people who we now recognize as the Brits considered bathing as something that was self-indulgent. And people were actually killed. You could be killed if you were caught bathing. Now that plays a very prominent role again because we consider the relationship between hygiene, prevention of disease, etc. We see the relationship here.